All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Either give me a thumbs up on camera or unmute and give me the word.
Yeah,
Perfect.
you're good, Drew.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so we're just going to give it a few minutes to get people logged in and all that stuff. But just a few little things. So we're going to be using the chat function. I've already put a few messages in there. So just go through those. And then just a reminder to please mute your mic when you're not speaking. It just eliminates some of that background noise that can kind of interfere with the presentation. So just keep that in mind. And then also, you may have heard the little voice that just said recording in progress. So we are going to be recording this presentation for future use. There will be components where we're going to be asking, or I will be asking to for people to participate and share their thoughts and stories, but those will be edited out of any public broadcast or posting of the presentation. So, all right. All right, so it just looks like some of those messages didn't go through earlier on, but basically it was just everything that I just said. So all good there, nothing too groundbreaking. One little thing too, just to encourage everyone, there are some instances, well, I will be asking for participation. So if you don't feel like participating, that's okay too, but I strongly encourage it because it does make it for a better, more wholesome discussion with the group. And yeah, I don't think everyone wants to just watch me ramble on for an hour and a bit. So, okay. All right. So we have a nice, good group to start here. So I'm going to get going. One last tech check. Everyone can hear me okay? I assume so. Okay. All right. So as mentioned, my name is Drew Sherbin and I'm with Alchemy Communications, and I'm going to be presenting the session on crisis communication planning today. Before we get started, I'd like to just start with a land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you from Calgary, Alberta, in Canada, and in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, Alchemy Communications, as an inhabitant of Calgary, Alberta, honors and acknowledges Mohkinstsis and the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, as well as the Stoney Nakoda and Tsuut'ina nations. We also acknowledge that the territory we work and live upon is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3 within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. Okay, so for those who aren't familiar with Alchemy Communications, we're a full-service marketing, PR, crisis comms firm based out of Calgary, Alberta, as I mentioned. We work with all sorts of organizations and companies, anywhere from nonprofits to small to mid-sized businesses to municipalities to pretty much anyone who needs communication support. We've probably worked with them. So, all right. Okay, so for the majority of people, just by signing up for this session, you probably have a general understanding and idea of what crisis communications is. It may be because you've experienced it firsthand in your workplace, or you've seen instances of news reports where they usually preface it by it's a breaking news story or developing, or it's a crisis situation. So yeah, so basically, I'm sure everyone has a bit of a familiarity with it. We're going to get into a little bit. I want to hear from everyone just kind of their own experiences a little bit later in the presentation. But for the purposes right now, so crisis communications, basically the crisis communications plans are needed when something unpredictable happens. So something that creates a potential to really damage or erode an organization's trust with the public. Whatever that instance, whenever that happens, there's obviously damage to trust, and what that can do, it can generate a lot of outcomes, and usually they are, and when you're in a crisis situation, there's usually starts with questions, but generally it starts to dip and dive into that negative outcome. Some negative outcome things or options could be losses of revenue if you're a for-profit business, loss of staff, a significant damage to the reputation of the organization or the heads of the organization. So presidents, CEOs, if we're talking municipal politics, maybe mayors, councilors. So basically anything that can have a negative effect on a number of different areas kind of goes into that crisis communications scenario and situation. And then it can also really just affect the future of businesses too. In some cases, there's been organizations that just have not been able to recover. And unfortunately, they no longer exist or provide their services to the general public. So basically what crisis communications does is it acknowledges the ways that the public perceives that event. So when something starts or something is happening or percolating, there's always going to be a positive, neutral, or a negative side to someone's perception of it, right? So it's really about understanding that and keeping a pulse on when the negatives start to bubble up. And in some cases, if your crisis plan or crisis communications plan is lack of a better term, working, those positives or those neutral feelings and thoughts and comments start to also make its way into the general public and the sphere of communication. So it's all three of those are major factors when kind of navigating the crisis, when it's a full-blown crisis, and then also when it's coming down, or even in situations when it may not even be a crisis. You might have initial thoughts where it could be seen as, oh, this is going to go sideways in a hurry. And if sometimes you just navigate and you monitor and it doesn't, but it's always good to be planning ahead, because I think often people have probably have heard this term before, where it's not when or not if a crisis situation is going to hit, it's when, right? So there's definitely truth to that, and having a solid plan can help navigate in those certain situations. So I mentioned trust. So you might be thinking, well, what does that matter when it comes to crisis situations? And what it does is it matters a lot, because that's usually one of the first things or the main thing that erodes or is damaged or is impacted when someone may hear of a situation that could be perceived as a crisis. So whether that's an employee or a customer or a constituent, or basically any member of the public that might interact with you or your organization, there is a level of trust there, and there's different levels of trust based on the relationship. So as I mentioned, trust forms that basis of any successful relationship, and without it, the cooperation, the collaboration, the communication, the interactions are really next to impossible if you don't have that trust. And it's very hard once it starts to erode or break down. It's difficult. It's not impossible, but it's hard to rebuild. And unfortunately, sort of what we're seeing in today's climate in terms of just communications in general and media, trust is in short supply sometimes, and it's really easy to be affected or eroded. And people are always kind of looking for that trustworthy source and fact or fact-based platform or whatever they're looking for. And sometimes that can get into the area of, sometimes we hear the term fake news or different terms of or different types of information that's being shared. At the end of the day, I think whatever you believe or whatever you want to fall in, you're just looking for that trust and looking for where you perceive or where you think is truth. So around that now, we're starting to see that there's this, again, with that searching and that looking for that truth, there's this uncertainty and fear in these echo chambers, whether it be social media or certain social circles or different areas. And it's really fueling, as I mentioned, that misinformation and bias, which can really turn and degrade that trust in organizations. Usually it starts with figureheads and top level, higher profile individuals or organizations. So that's just one thing to kind of keep in mind when we're dealing with crisis communication situations and scenarios, is probably 9 times out of 10, we're going to always go back to that situation where has trust been eroded? Has it been impacted? Has an action, a comment, a perceived message negatively impacted someone where that trust is broken between the individuals or the organizations? Okay, so crisis situations, and these aren't limited to just these, and usually they can be anything from smaller. We tend to sometimes go to the higher, obviously, examples of crisis. So data breaches, active shooters, resident petitions, boycotts or cancellations, but they can really, depending on your organization and your business or your kind of personal reputation, they can be anything that you deem to be negatively impacting your current situation. So there could be situations where there's maybe what you might perceive as a smaller issue might be actually larger for maybe someone else, right? So examples of that could maybe be like there's internal issues. We see a lot of like employee HR potential issues that could be deemed as crisis, depending on the grounds around termination or anything like that. So it's just really, really important. So when you get into building your crisis communications plans, or even thinking about what those look like, it's important to identify those potential risk factors that generally relate to you or your organization. Not to say that you don't want to have the big ones, like obviously, as we've just seen with pandemic reaction and protocols, you want to have those in place. I don't think many people really have those ready to go ahead of COVID, just because they never, in our lifetime, we've never seen that, but now it's a reality. So it's just always important to really hone in on the ones that obviously you think will be probably the ones that will be likely to hit, but it's also good to keep in mind ones that even though you think might not be really relevant, it's always good to have a plan around those as well. Okay, so crisis communications and situations around basically the world and everything in the current landscape of 2022 as we head into 2023. This may come as no surprise, but obviously with the prevalence and impact that social media has, our increased sort of reliance, and not only from a public side of things, but also as a business or an organization, our reliance on that to not only hear the message, but get the message out there and stay connected is really, if it hasn't gained traction, it's one of the main, if not the main way of communication. And usually when crisis situations start, could be based on maybe a comment seen on social, or a video that was posted to social, or a tweet from 10 years ago or 7 years ago that has resurfaced based on maybe someone's rise in the public sphere and someone dug something out. So there's always things that can be pulled out, especially now with this world of social media in terms of the way information is transmitted and received. So it's a lot more complex than it used to be. Usually in the past, sort of before social, and even in the early stages of social, when you hear crisis, it usually the organization may have heard it first, or it could be you get a call from a local reporter because they've heard something, or someone has contacted them, and it's, you had a little bit of time to kind of buy and understand the situation, but now it's almost immediate. So it's just one thing to really keep an eye on. And we do offer social media seminars and training in terms of sort of other topics of what to post, when to post, stuff like that. So if you're interested, there's some contact information at the end, and I'd be happy to discuss those presentations as well. Okay, before we kind of get into like the meat of what goes into a plan or the crisis communication scenarios, I just wanted to touch on a few things that, again, could be seen as the impetus or reasons for potential crisis. So just by maybe a show of hands or in the chat, how many people have heard of the term cancel culture or being canceled? Or it's one of those words that is very, very popular these days. I see a few yeps. Hands up. Yep. Okay. Great. Yeah. So it's one of those words that have kind of entered the lexicon of communications, and we are hearing this, oh, so and so has been canceled, or they're under attack for something they've said and they may be canceled. So what we're seeing is this, and this data was pulled from in 2020, is that or from 2018 to 2020, and basically it indicates that there is a rise in what we're seeing in terms of that interest of search of what cancel culture is, and kind of the term in general. So basically, what is cancel culture? So we hear about this, we usually know when it's happening, but basically what it is it refers to the practice of pulling back or withdrawing or canceling supports of usually public figures or people in high profile positions after they've either said something, done something, or have been called out or seen as doing something that is considered objectionable or offensive. So usually what we're seeing, a lot of it celebrity, or it's usually tied to that, the higher profile, but it can really go all the way down to different levels just based on your kind of circle. And it's not kind of just reserved for celebrity status or high profile. Like, it could be forms of cancellation or forms of kind of that pulling back support can affect all levels and all people or all organizations. So it's generally discussed as really being performed usually or seen on social media in the form of, usually it's the call out or the group shaming or just that really getting that message out there. So it really it has roots to a lot of different areas. And what it does is it basically, its aim is to bring that accountability or calling out the powerful people that may have previously been immune to potential consequences. So as I mentioned, as we kind of move forward in this social media space, and that's kind of the world we live in now, it's really just increasing. And I think the pandemic that we were coming out of and still currently in, depending on who you speak to, it's only really increased that impact and the power of the internet and that form of communication. So the challenges around that is the criteria and the goalposts, they tend to move. Sometimes supporters argue that the cancel culture is an important tool, as I mentioned, in holding those people or groups accountable, especially when looking at movements such as in social justice or giving voices to those who may have been historically shut out. But there's a flip side where critics can argue that the movement limits that open debate and the free exchange of ideas sometimes. And we're getting to see a point where it's just, that's the immediate knee-jerk reaction is you're canceled without understanding or dealing or learning with the situation and education around it. So it's really hard because what we're dealing with different thoughts and opinions and values. So what is the definition of unacceptable, problematic, or offensive? So that's, I think, where we come in with crisis planning or even message planning. So in situations similar to one of the examples that was shared, where someone immediately thought, oh my gosh, they're teaching pornography to students. It's a no, this is what we're actually doing. And this is the messaging around it. This is let's have a conversation. Whereas knee-jerk immediate reaction is, this is wrong, cancel, get rid of it, don't want to hear about it, done. Right. So it's because that's, in the lack of a better term, that's the voice that usually gets the more attention or the loudest. It's like they've done something horribly wrong and this is why. So I think creating that dialogue, and with a crisis communications plan, you're prepared to enter that conversation and either defend or not prove, but just elevate or even discuss the issues that maybe you're working with, or something that you may have been called out on. You can discuss it in a forum, or even invite people for face-to-face discussions as well. Because as everyone knows, that especially now, and not saying it didn't exist before, but there's this wide spectrum of opinions, values, and ideologies. And now with everything at a click of a button. It's easy to get information or learn about, or even debate, a lot easier than it may have been 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So around that whole cancel culture idea, I mentioned social media, and what we're really starting to see that really relates to crisis situations is, as I mentioned, social media is usually one of the first places where things start to cook or start to percolate, or where you can get a good sense of understanding where an issue might turn into maybe a level 1 issue all the way into a crisis situation. So it's really good to understand and have a pulse on your current social channels or the conversation that's happening around either yourself or your organization, just to understand what the likelihood of maybe what would that crisis scenario look like, or what would maybe be the topic that could be a potential issue. Because again, it's not a matter of sort of when, it's if it's when it's going to happen, right? So it's just understanding and really just at the end of the day, it's just planning and really understanding of what could happen, right? So there's a multitude of ways that social can be used to really, as I mentioned, get that information out there. And sometimes in terms of canceling or getting that, it's mobilization of people or groups towards either a belief or getting that opinion, or, hey, did you see this is awful? Or on the flip side, there's positives to it too. I don't want to come across as saying that social is evil and we should all log off of Twitter or Facebook, because that's the reality is shouldn't say impossible, but for a lot of businesses, it is hard to really try and cut off that arm of social interaction as well. So it's just a matter of really understanding and learning how to navigate that space. One thing is that it really plays when you hear the term going viral, or something has a lot of views or likes or clicks, there is usually an emotion attached to that, whether it be positive or negative. So the virality of that campaign or that message could be, in this situation of crisis, is usually skewed towards that negativity or that negative space. So people are retweeting because they're outraged or they're upset, or they want to share that as they, again, go to that mobilization of potential crisis situation. So it's just, like I said, important to really understand in your own businesses and organizations what that may look like on social media. Okay, so why do you need a crisis comms plan? I think everyone has probably thought about or heard, or yeah, we need that. And sometimes it's like, oh, I just don't know how to do it, or we don't have the time, don't have resources, or what goes in it, or I can just handle it on my own, because we rarely get crisis or situations. I don't think we've ever had a crisis, so we don't need one. So there's a lot of different layers and reasonings on kind of the thoughts around crisis communications planning. I strongly recommend that there is some form, whether even if you are in a position where you do have a bit of cachet, or you're a higher level executive, even a personal communications crisis plan works, or organizations. I would strongly recommend that there's some sort of crisis communications planning or framework that you have at the ready or start to implement. And as we go on, and at the end of this presentation, we can talk about, if you're interested, we provide that option to help you kind of navigate. Even if you've had one, sometimes we've seen that they just sit on a shelf for, oh yeah, it's that binder that's on that bookshelf, right? No one's ever looked at it, but it's about 200 pages of what we do when stuff goes sideways. So sometimes it can be intimidating too, but we are there to really is help and assist with that. Okay, so basically again, it's really tying back to this rise of the social media. So that is, at the end of the day, can be treated as sources now. So in the past, you may have heard like media source, and that was the trusted source of media. So I saw it on TV, and it usually hits the airwaves or the print publications, and then it's news. But now anything can be perceived as potential sources or information or news. So it's really about understanding and navigating, as I mentioned. So if anything, it has just ramped up that need for crisis planning, because it's more likely to happen now. It's almost, in lack of a better term, it's a lot scarier, right? So given the speed of which that information really progresses through social media, so if you cannot respond, and I'll preface that with, again, what I said before about responding, like, what does immediately mean to you? It doesn't mean as soon as you see it, I have to get on there and say no, or it's just you have to bide that time, or buy your time to whenever immediately fits for you. So if that immediately is, if you're ready and you have your crisis plan ready to go and your messages are tight and you're ready to rock, and okay, it could be 10 minutes after, or it's like, oh, we need to think it could be an hour after. There's still that immediacy based on the situation. So as I mentioned before, sometimes you can really exacerbate the situation or put yourself even further into a potential crisis by thinking you're doing the right thing, but just because speed might play an impact in that message you might get out there, that could be perceived as elevating or escalating the situation if you don't have the correct information. One thing with when we're starting to get into these crisis situations and the importance of that plan is that there's an element of preparedness that you'll need to have and be at the ready, because whatever the situation or whatever the crisis, you do need to be prepared to handle, whether it be a response or a question, or you're starting to see, and those can come in various forms. So questions on social, or questions from employees, or questions from the public, questions from media. It all sort of fits in with the planning scenarios of, okay, well, if we get this question, who do we contact? If we start to see this, who needs to know? So it's really about, when you're in that planning stages, of identifying your key stakeholders, who needs to know about certain situations and scenarios when they happen. If it's internal, I strongly recommend that if you're in an organization where you have staff or employees, that they are also in tune with what's going on, because that could also negatively impact if the situation goes on further, and maybe someone starts tweeting out, hey, I work here and I've heard nothing about this. So that could be perceived as being negative as well. And then saying I've heard nothing of this, but it is a situation, right? Not saying I've heard nothing, so it isn't true. It's different layers around that, right? So it's really important to really nail down who needs to be. It's almost like when you're doing, if anyone has experience with doing communications plans or marketing plans, when you segment and target your audiences, you might have primary audiences, secondary audiences. This situation is no different. So it's really about understanding who needs to know what, and then that timeliness also plays into it too. One thing to remember too is that you can't control every aspect of that crisis. But what you can do is you can manage your part or your role in that. And that kind of goes through the messaging. So if you can prepare the groundwork and lay the foundation of those messages ahead of time, then it's easier to really understand or navigate a current situation, because it sort of sounds, and it's almost like, to use a term or an analogy, it's like practicing, right? If you're practicing, like say for sports, if you're practicing a certain play and then there's a situation in the game where that presents itself where you can run that play. So in football, for example, then you roll it out. And the more you practice it, the more efficient you are at it. And the more, in terms of, in this regard, success might look at mitigating the impacts of a potential crisis situation. The likelihood of that happening is it goes down the more you practice or more prepared you are, right? So it's for sports fans or whatever, if you want to use that analogy and think of it as an easier way to kind of the reason for planning and practicing, that's one thing that I tend to do. And one thing, and we'll talk about a little bit in the presentation, is that it's always good to hold crisis scenarios, training scenarios with your staff, and you can run through exercises and workshops that kind of mimic a real life situation, right? So that's something we offer too, and it's actually really fun and engaging if you have a really fun scenario, and I should say fun for me because I enjoy this stuff, but it could be a headache for others. But yeah, it's always good to practice that as well. Okay, so just continuing on with that, what is a crisis plan and what goes into that crisis planning stages, or whether it's if you have a binder, if you're old school, or if you have a shared drive folder with crisis planning documents, what really goes into those. So the biggest thing is that these situations warrant communication. So the first thing that we really want to look at is that messaging and those statements, those sample key messages of what we're going to use in the event of certain crisis situations. So going all the way back to when you're identifying the potential scenario that might affect your business, you try and build your messages around that potential situation. So depending on your organization, you might have one scenario, you might have 4 scenarios, you might have 10 scenarios, just depending on the level of your business or what you have identified as potential issues or potential crisis situations. So with those, you would come up with different sample messages, and we have a little exercise coming up based on a scenario that we'll all run through. But you basically build those draft or shell messages based on what may or may not happen, as mentioned. So, okay, so another area of the plan, and I mentioned before, it's really important to not only identify who needs to know the information, but also designate who is going to be sending out that information, who is the designated crisis role within that scenario. So in a lot of organizations, excuse me, they have crisis teams or strategic communications crisis. In the event of a crisis, this team is implemented. So it's usually someone's day-to-day role. It wouldn't be involved in that, but that if there's a crisis situation, they may be pulled in to be the media relations lead or the social media lead. So it's really about identifying roles within your organization and roles that make sense. If you're a smaller organization, it's harder to try and fill all these positions with multiple people if the reality is they just don't exist. So what does that look like? Does that look like outsourcing when the crisis hits? Does it look like really keying in on, because the last thing you want to do is perceive everything to be a crisis and then you're just working on that all the time, right? So it's just about establishing those processes and protocols and what is a crisis, when do we respond, stuff like that. So again, the second to last point here is just that preparation or that practice. Again, like sports, the more you run the play, the more you practice it, the readier, the better prepared you're going to be for these situations, right? And that goes anything from whether you're doing media interviews if you want to do a recorded message to your staff, if you're holding even a staff town hall in the event of a crisis and you need to update, kind of lay of the land, what's happening, the more prepared you are, the easier you are to deliver that and potentially face difficult questions, right? So you don't want to be caught flat-footed in certain scenarios. So that's the idea of this crisis planning, is to be ready when things happen. And one thing to really key in on is when you start building out your plans or even thinking about crisis situations is really look at maybe if there's a current plan or situations that are running through your head and you kind of perceive those weaknesses. So what's maybe a weakness that could prevent you from executing a crisis plan or handling that, or what did we maybe do differently in a previous scenario that we can put into our crisis plan as an example, right? To basically, lack of a better term, not do again, or if something happens like this, refer to here, this is how we handled it. And it's, again, just that top of mind information and learning that it's happened before, this is how we handled it, learn from it, and then taking the steps to move forward with that. Okay, so an effective crisis communications plan, strategy, playbook, I've heard all different terms, whatever you want to call it. what that will do is it gives you the ability to not only disseminate the information quickly publicly when you're ready, but also internally. So if you are prepared and you understand kind of, you've identified what the scenario may be through research and potential of things happening, and you're like, okay, it's go time. It happened. We're ready. Like, this is our moment, right? So it's important. Then you can really start to disseminate the critical information of that potential scenario, which in turn will allow you to disseminate that information publicly or to your internal audiences, or if you're dealing with maybe funding partners with them, like it's just a layers of information and basically who needs to know what, and in timely fashions as well. What it does too is it really, going all the way back to the beginning of what scenarios may look like, usually they damage reputations of companies or individuals. So what this does is it protects, and I'll use that term protect, like sometimes there are situations where what someone has done is you can only really, there's only so much you can do to mitigate. Like at the end of the day, sometimes it's like, this is bad. Like we need to just do our best. It's not, you're not going to solve it, or you may not come out. There will be damages to reputation. So one thing that just you need to keep in mind is that you just need to do your best to sort of protect within reason, right? So sometimes you need to identify, okay, this is gonna hurt for a bit, or this will sting. So this is going back to the plan, how we're going to mitigate and work our way through certain scenarios. What it will also do is it takes into consideration, depending on the scenario, you don't want to always be thinking about maybe your company reputation. You have to, and this is in good communications plans too, is depending on the scenario, you need to prioritize what is actually happening. So if it's a situation where people have been impacted in terms of loss of life, or family members have been impacted with injuries, you have to prioritize that before your messaging around your organization, right? So it's that empathy, that care and concern that you always have to demonstrate, and you have to be aware of when dealing with situations like that. And sometimes with the best of intentions can kind of come across negatively. I don't have some examples here, but if you just do a quick Google search or YouTube on media interviews that went wrong, you can find hundreds of them that you can tell like the person is trying to be positive, but they're not hitting the mark. Okay, so I've talked a lot about like communicating, and when you hear stories or thoughts, like in the term the narrative. So what is that? So basically what that is the stories and the thoughts that go into or come into people's minds when yourself or your organization is mentioned. So it's how people interact with you, it's their experience, it's whether they're purchasing something or whether they're getting a service, or even your employees, it's how they interact maybe on a day-to-day work environment basis. So it's how they interact and how they experience you or your organization. The narrative can also be used on social media. So what are others saying about you? What is that? Do you have a positive sort of narrative around social? Is it sort of, they're kind of again, there's all different examples of what people may perceive your organization to be, or you as an individual as well. And then what you say about yourself. So how do you perceive, or how do you present your narrative, right? So again, tying it back to the crisis planning, and when we're doing our messaging, or when we're doing media interviews, or if we're posting statements, it's what's the narrative that we are presenting? And I guess, for lack of a better term too, it should be genuine. If it isn't, then you'll have issues that are beyond this, right? So it's really about putting that narrative that you've created for your company, or and not, I shouldn't say created, but that if you live day to day, it should be a lot easier to portray as well. Okay, so I talked a lot about crisis communications in kind of the realm of when it's pointed out that there may be a perceived mistake, or something has been said, or something has been dug up, or something presented that has negatively impacted the public perception of your organization or yourself. And where we're at now is that an apology that's where we're at. So the apology is something that makes sense. So again, so as I mentioned, there's different layers of crisis comms. Sometimes apologies don't fit the scenario, but in the purpose of this presentation today, we'll just be talking about that if we've identified that the apology makes sense, then how do we do that? How do we navigate that? How do we understand that? So as I mentioned before, it's really about acknowledging the impact of others over defending the impact on you or your organization. That can happen, but you just got to make sure that you're framing it in a way that you're acknowledging the important, or the other people affected or organizations affected first. Another thing to understand is that there's a time and a place to really understand and learn and talk about what went wrong. But if your immediate reaction is to try and save face or shift or take that focus off of you or be defensive, then it can be perceived as you're making it. So as I mentioned, it can escalate or elevate the situation by saying, yeah, he's just making it, or they're just making it all about themselves, and they're missing the point here, right? So that can elevate the situation even more so. So it's just really important to understand that. Again, it goes back to that understanding of the facts, learning, taking the time to really know what's happening and what you need to say. So sometimes when we hear crisis comms, it's like, oh, crisis situation is happening, we need to save our butts, or so you just need to think about kind of what that looks like. That may come, but may not be right away. So another important point here in the second bullet point in the presentation is to understand that there are no quick fixes to these. It's really about navigating the ebbs and flows of situations. If it has gotten to a point where you have identified that this is a crisis situation, whatever that may look like for your group or organization, it's just about the timeline of that and navigating, whether it's 2 days, a week, a month. Sometimes the impacts of situations can be felt years down the road. So it's just really understanding that timeline. And when you have a plan and your understanding of that, it can go a long way to really almost preparing people to say, hey, this isn't gonna go away tomorrow, or on the flip side, say, yeah, not to downplay it, but yeah, what we're tracking or what we've seen, it could be getting better maybe in a week, or it's really about just navigating those waters of the timeline. That being said, it's really hard because in current kind of conditions of where we're at in terms of culture and just the way the world is, it's this need or this thirst for that instant gratification and instant solutions is upon us. It's hard. It's like, well, no, I need this fixed now, or I want to hear about it now, or you got to do something about it now. And it's just like, oh, that can be is equally as intimidating and trying when you're trying to navigate potential crisis situations that, let's be honest, are usually negative and are hard to handle this stuff. So it's really about just understanding that the accountability and that real accountability, that the genuineness, it takes time. You just have to keep that in the back of your mind as well. And then the final point is show humility. You need to show that when in terms of dealing with these situations, especially in crisis communications situations or scenarios. So building that empathy, it shows that there's a bit of vulnerability around that, and it's sometimes it can be uncomfortable, but again, the more you practice and the more your understanding of potential situations, the easier it may be to handle in a situation where maybe personal biases or questioned or attacked, or even internally, like maybe if you're working for an organization and it's like, you don't jive with that. Like the more you understand ahead of time, you can take steps to maybe raise that question or work with potential messages that say, hey, you know what, these messages, they really fall flat. Like if you're practicing, it can go a long way in building that plan out or having those messages ready for when a crisis hits. Okay, so now we're going to do a little bit of an exercise. And since we have quite a few people joining us today, we usually split it up into groups, but since there's quite a few of us, we'll just do individual. Feel free, if you don't want to participate, that's fine too, but I just encourage if you can just look at this, and even if you just take a screenshot or think about it after, it'll help wherever you are in your crisis communications planning journey. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to present you with a scenario, and then a quick little exercise will be just to jot down or create 3 key messages or messages for your fictitious organization that are based on this example. And then the next step of that will be to put together just a quick holding statement or message. It doesn't have to be long, just kind of basically what we're looking for is just if you can identify in this scenario, what are the main points that need to be addressed in this exercise. So, and then everything will be as if it's happening today. So if you write your statement, you could say today or earlier today. Okay, so here is the scenario. So your organization has decided to launch an anti-racism strategy meant to look at where the barriers or systemic racism may be showing up in your services and structures. However, there has been a vocal backlash to this work online, and a petition has been launched with thousands of signatures. There are protesters who are now showing up regularly at your place of business, and they are disrupting the regular work of your employees. So this one is a little bit of a curveball, because it's like, is it anti-racism? Like, that shouldn't everyone be on board? Like, so, but in certain scenarios, there are still groups or vocal that will make noise, right? So what you need to do, as I mentioned, so create 3 statements, and they don't have to be long. Even if they're a sentence, just create those statements that are the main points of information that you want your audience to hear, understand, and remember. Create the holding statement again based on the details, and I'll go back to that slide and leave it up so you can look at the scenario. So out of those points, so with the basic details that have been confirmed, what you're doing or actions that you're taking in response. Remember that what I mentioned about the empathy, compassion, concern, and humility, if warranted in this case. And then what are you doing for those involved? And then updates moving forward. So just a little kind of tip on that. Sometimes what you could say is, due to depending on the scenario, due to the nature of the investigation, we'll be providing updates after working with police. Or if you do know that, you can say we're going to be providing an update later today, or once we've gathered more information. All right, so are there any initial questions around that? I'll go back to the slide, but does anyone have any questions?
I have a question for you, Drew.
Sure. Yeah.
So what is the nature of the backlash? Are they like accusing the company that they're being disingenuous with their?
Yes. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's a great question. Sorry. So it is based around being disingenuous. They feel like it's a knee-jerk reaction to years of mistreatments to members of BIPOC community, right?
So, and our organization kind of has a history of that. Is that the idea?
Yes.
Or perceived history.
Perceived history. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
No problem. Okay, so we'll give you about 15 minutes to do that. So take your time, and then we'll get to the next step of it. Okay, how's everyone doing? Do we need more time or are we ready to go? Okay, I'm gonna take that as ready to go. Okay. All right, so either in the chat or just on mic there, how did everyone find this exercise?
It was good.
Okay, great. Tricky, yeah. Yeah, as I mentioned, sometimes it is tricky, but the more you do it, you see what I mean? Like it's practice, right? So all good.
I found it difficult because there wasn't enough information provided.
Yeah, it's hard, and I understand that it's not the perfect scenario or way. It's just kind of what it kind of does is just kind of getting that, because sometimes you might not get all the information too, right? In a real life scenario as well. So yeah, it can be a challenge. It's not a test, it's not a pass or fail thing. It's just more to kind of get the brain going and thinking about potential scenarios. But thanks for that feedback.
For the purposes of the exercise, it might have been helpful to have both, the scenario and then the statement requirements, on the screen, if possible.
Sure. Oh, sure. Yeah. Sorry, I kept the one there. I could have moved it back. Yeah. I could make that adjustment so it's all in one.
I feel like I probably missed about
That's
half.
okay. Yeah, it's not designed to be like, oh, you should have had that. It's just more of a discussion and kind of get some thoughts around doing it. So that being said, does anyone want to maybe share what they came up with or put it in the chat and we can discuss as a group? And maybe there's some general themes that everyone had that we'll notice, but
I can take a stab at it.
sure.
So I don't know if I think in writing my key messages that I kind of created a holding statement as I was doing each point.
Sure.
But so I thought probably the first thing that we would need to do is appreciate, to state that we appreciate that our efforts to explore these areas where systemic racism may be showing up, that we appreciate that it has been perceived as disingenuous, and that we are sincerely sorry for this, that it has come off this way, and it is not our intention. And that the next point would be that we are deeply committed to understanding the issues facing BIPOC communities, and we're committed to creating a safe, equitable space. And then to say that we are consulting members of BIPOC communities to to review the strategy and be part of the solution. And that we are truly committed to deepening our understanding of this and creating change.
Great. Sounds like you did very good job. You took that, put the empathy and you addressed that right off the bat. And I liked how you you used the word appreciate that right at the top, like to kind of acknowledge that there was negativity or some perceived negative things have happened, then you called it right out. So it doesn't come across like you're like hiding anything. It's we're willing to understand and work. No, very good. Good job. It was yeah, I know this can be tricky sometimes and you're like on the spot, what do I say? But no, that was a very good good messaging. Good. Okay, I got a few that came in on the chat, so I'll just read those out. So first one here. So here are my 3 points. We have launched an immediate investigation into this issue and have assigned Brad Chase as our spokesperson to speak on our behalf. Brad will be available to respond to your questions, concerns, and brief you on the steps that we are taking daily to ensure that we have short and long-term plans for dealing with concerns of our internal and external stakeholders. We will be providing updates on the current situation daily. Please stay tuned to our social media platforms and our website. Second point, we are updating our training materials on an urgent basis and will be offering opportunities for staff and volunteers to be aware of our diversity and inclusion related practices. Okay, and the final point here of that same person's what they put together is we are also updating our practices of customer feedback on their experience as an opportunity to demonstrate our commitment to our customers' success and learn about their expectations. Very good. Two different approaches and styles, but I think they're both relevant in this case. I think what you did here was you took that more direct kind of approach on who, what, when, the more succinct points, which is good. There could be an opportunity to be called out as just being tone deaf to it, maybe depending on the situation, but it is a good message for conveying that information. So again, there's no right or wrong here. It's not about passing or failing, or it's just navigating and learning through different situations as they present themselves. Okay, got a bunch here. Okay, one sec. Oh, just a comment here that our team here, the three of us, took the spirit of the assignment and applied it to a real situation in our workplace. And it was very helpful in the conversation starter that has led to some real action steps. Well, I'm glad that you could use that and it's helping you in the real world. Yeah, that's awesome. Great. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, next here, first point. Okay, recently we have announced our intention to launch our plans to implement a new equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy for our organization. In response, we have received feedback from and would like to acknowledge that some of our important stakeholders have identified concerns about our strategy. We apologize to those who have raised those concerns about our intended response to our EDI strategy. It was not our intent to overlook the concerns of the past, but to create a new journey forward where we can stand together in an all-inclusive manner. We would ask for the opportunity to listen and learn, live an EDI strategy for our company. Sorry, opportunity to listen and learn and live an EDI strategy for our company. And the third point, in response, we will be conducting an opportunity to collect feedback from all of our stakeholders on our current strategy. This is going to be done to recognize the importance of the contributions of equity that deserving groups in our company and our society. We will be making a donation to a relevant charity to further support the needs of equity deserving peoples in our communities. Very good. Kind of a combo of the first couple, so that really pulled in the information and the details on what you're doing, and then did show that empathy and that empathetic voice and that care and concern. One thing I would just caution, and I know it's in the spirit of this exercise, it was in there, but when we start to say things like making donations and working with charity groups, make sure that you connect with that group before or ahead of time, because sometimes I've seen in scenarios it can create a backlash if they say, yeah, they never actually contacted us, or we have never heard from them, or what. So, or maybe that it might not even fit with that that charitable organization. I know in this, let's just take it for that you did all that in this exercise, but just for real world examples or real world practices, just make sure that you connect those pieces as well. And sometimes depending on the situation, it can go right down to the person working on the project. Like you need to make sure it all fits, because there's been instances where the best of intentions have been called out and they just get it singled out, and you just don't want to fall into that trap. But very good. Does anyone else want to share? That was it for the chat. But if anyone wants to maybe even just reflect on kind of what they've heard, or comments from maybe what they've heard in other statements, or questions about some approaches that people took, or even questions about current things that are maybe happening that you'd want some feedback on. Okay, we got one in here. Okay, so the company, we'll just call this the company name. It's Fake Organization. Would like to first recognize the struggles, discrimination, and injustices that have been suffered by the BIPOC community. We would also like to acknowledge that historically, we have contributed to the struggles of marginalized communities, whether knowingly or unknowingly, and this must change. Our current anti-racism strategy is not a safe face moment, but the beginning of a long-term collaborative commitment to change within our organization and to contribute to change for racialized communities. Great job. Fantastic. You took that empathetic voice and you made it your own. I think in this situation, this would be a good one, depending on the thoughts and feelings of what people, like obviously there's protesters, and not saying that with the other statements or messages, at this point, they don't want to hear about your next steps of your strategy and how you're going to do this and that. It's the reality of it, so that you really captured that that spirit of acknowledging that, look, this has happened. There's people who have been deeply affected and impacted, and we are committed to changing it. And I like how you emphasize that this must change, and also to the point, knowingly or unknowingly. So this isn't a time to debate, right? It's not a point of, well, you know, that didn't really happen, but it's acknowledging it, right? So very, very good approach to that. Does anyone have any thoughts? Kind of, and we've heard a few that have kind of been all over the map and taking pieces from each other, but I would love to hear some thoughts on what other people have presented. Okay. Did anyone feel, I guess, with this exercise, could someone see this like obviously it is a potential scenario, but was the exercise a little too out there, or just for learning, my own learning, just would it be more about something that is easier to understand, or I guess just a little bit more details around it, or was it good? Just love to hear some feedback on that as well.
I thought it was very realistic.
Okay.
Mhm.
Good.
You know, like people are just not as accepting of, you know, kind of the company line, or, you know, what have you, as maybe they were in the past, and they are going to challenge intentions and the approach that you're taking and such. I think it was very realistic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Just noticing some comments on there. A little bit more detail would have been helpful. Okay, great. Okay, and then vagueness helped because sometimes you can cater it to your own, and like I said, sometimes you don't have all the details and you got to navigate. So, but I think, yeah, in purpose of this, I appreciate the participation in the comments.
I guess my question is, just out of curiosity, for when you're dealing with issues like this, right? Where it's an anti-racism strategy, and I think where I was going earlier with not a lot of details is that my gut as a communicator is, especially with highly sensitive, with the deep-rooted history of an issue, is to avoid sort of those blanket type statements. And that's, I think, where I was going with that, because it just seems to me that it would be very, just not genuine. And if I was on the other end of that, it would fuel it versus address it. And I think that that's where I was going with the details. And I know it's hard to put it into one slide, but I think that if that was me and I had to respond to it, the first thing I would be doing is seeing exactly what was said, what specific groups, all of those types of things. And that's where it was really hard for me to formulate something, just not having all of those key pieces to ensure that I don't damage a reputation further by throwing that blanket statement out.
Totally. Yeah, no, totally. And the fact that you thought about that and just said that is great, right? So the fact that you're thinking in that mindset of okay, so you saw that scenario and it's like, yeah, well, we need to understand deeper, because imagine if that came and you didn't have, whereas sometimes it'd be like, oh, let's just respond, get it out there. But if you think through it, I need to know more, and then so yeah, exactly. Like you sometimes there are situations and scenarios, and it goes back to that what I was saying about give yourself time. You need to understand what has happened or what is happening or stuff like that, because it does prevent those situations. If you did just throw out a blanket statement of that negative, or maybe it could be like, oh, see, I told you so. It's just reaffirming what we're already saying. So it's all this is good conversation and important to take and build into the real life scenarios when you're faced with them. So thanks for that. Okay, and then a comment here, in the case of social media, negative feedback, sometimes taking it offline is more helpful. Totally agree. If there's instances and scenarios where you can acknowledge and bring that person into a conversation that is offline, it is good. It is a good way to do it. Be mindful though that sometimes it can have, I guess, not negative, but it can backfire a bit depending on the message that you send to the person directly, or trying to bring it into a offline space. They might use that and say, no, I want to talk about this online. I want to talk about this. If you can say something to me, you can say it to everyone. So sometimes that you just got to be mindful and aware of that. That could be a message that gets out there. So just be mindful. Any message, even if it's direct, make sure you can't be taken certain ways, or you just got to be making sure it's the message you want to convey. Again, that reputation, that what is that message, or what is that tone that you're trying to present on all forms of communication. So, but that is a great point. So sometimes if you can take it offline and get it done that way, recommend doing that as well. Okay. So basically, in just summarizing, now that we kind of went through that exercise and just understanding what real world scenarios look like, and the idea of preparing and doing all this background beforehand, what does that actually look like? And I guess what it does is, by taking that action now, you're really preventing, I shouldn't even say preventing, but not even avoiding, but you're preparing yourself better for a potential crisis later. So if you're not prepared, the crisis situation, it could, and it will drain significant resources from you as a person, even brain resources and brain power, and more importantly, sometimes even your whole mental health can be affected if you're dealing with, depending on your industry or organization, it can take a lot, and it takes a toll on people. So just be mindful of your own mental health around these situations. And to that point, the more you prepare and plan, the more ready you are to maybe face situations that could be seen as being difficult to take in and understand and deal with on a day-to-day basis. So it's really about understanding those steps and taking those steps to act on everything from values to plans to who are we connecting with, before and ahead of time, before that situation really becomes a crisis. So just to summarize a few of the points here, it's just identifying those risks. Are we missing the mark on things, or are we the exact opposite? Have we identified, the best of our ability, what may be considered a risk to our organization? So when you're creating that plan, strategy, playbook, identify those. And one thing that I'd just like to mention too is that it's an ever evolving document. It's almost like a working plan. Things can change, things can be added, things can be moved down, things can be modified or edited, right? It's not one of those, I guess the framework and the the roles and responsibilities don't really change too much depending on your organization, but the messaging, the thoughts, the feelings, the what you want to portray, maybe some of the risk factors, those can be changing. So I recommend routinely looking at the plan or updating as you go. So that's just a good kind of reminder as well. Big thing too is invest in this. So invest in your communications plans, policies, invest in the training, invest in the expertise. Not saying it can be taken two ways. You can invest dollars, money, you can invest resources, you can invest time, you can make it a priority for your organization to really build upon these policies. But whatever that level of investment or that whatever you're investing, you're taking to invest, just make sure you take the time to do that. Big thing too is learn from the people that maybe you've identified as could be risks, or your constituents or your audiences. Learn from them, understand what makes them tick. Maybe again, it kind of goes back to that research, and build them into maybe some of the not the decision-making process of the plan, but maybe if there's opportunities. So an example of this real world scenario example that we used, can you bring them into the conversation about developing these policies or hearing from them? And some people mentioned that in their statements and read them out loud that they'll be doing that. So it's a good way to think as well. Listening. So listening, as I mentioned, to listening to your audience or your people, but also kind of that broader social listening. So utilize the tools that are out there for media monitoring, for social media monitoring. Kind of get that pulse on the conversation of whatever is affecting your product, your service, your organization. If it's personal, your perception, your reputation as it's presented, what are people saying about you or your business, right? So that goes a long way in learning and then crafting potential responses or potential strategies around doing things. If you're a person or if your organization is seeing that you're always out there confronting issues and you're first to be on the scene publicly, that can go a long way as well. But again, it all goes back to that. If that's not you, don't try and force it. You have to be genuine, because if you do it once and then never again, you might get called out. And there's certain scenarios that could, again, exacerbate or create that crisis situation for you. And then also too, the last 2 points that kind of go hand in hand is that inspire and communicate. So find out, and it goes with that learning point, but find out what the community cares about, or what in some cases, your employees, your audience, what do they care about, and get that kind of working for you, or understanding that you're taking those points or those pieces and you're using that in your not only crisis plans, but maybe even general awareness or general communications planning, or how you present yourself in social space or media interviews, whatever. Just have that the idea of utilizing what your community cares about and trying to instill those in your own values as well. And then the last point of communication is taking all this really, and then figuring out how are we keeping community or audience members informed and engaged. Sometimes what can happen is that a crisis situation might come up because people feel that they're not informed or engaged, or they're left out, or they're unaware of certain things. And this can go all the way from if you have customers or a service offering, or if you're a service-based organization, all the way to your employees too. So internal communications or internal office dealings, inner workings can also be a space for a potential crisis situation. So it's really about understanding how they tick, right? And so maybe that's beefing up your internal comms policies and keeping everyone engaged and informed on messages. Because one thing that if we go back to crisis scenarios, sometimes in certain situations, your staff or your employees or your board or whoever, maybe someone who has that internal view and lens and is more aware of internal things, they can be your best, lack of a better term, weapons or champions for getting that message out there. So if people are feeling connected, if they're feeling that they're part of the organization, they know what's going on, then they're more inclined or able to help share that message. So an example might be if you find yourself in a crisis situation and everyone in your organization is informed on next steps and what's happening, and maybe to a point, like certain areas need to know certain levels of details, but if they have the general understanding, then maybe they may be in a conversation, whether on social or in person, and they may be able to say, yeah, you know what, that's not exactly what happened, or this is, yes, that's what happened, but this is what we're doing. And it's like your own little megaphone. You're using your employees or your champions to help you, right? And not in a term of using as in like they're doing it because they feel connected and committed to the organization. So just had a question come in. Will we have access to these slides? Yes, you will. I'll be sending them around after. So I have everyone's everyone who registered. I do have their email, but if there's another email, just pop it in the chat and I can take that down. But you'll be getting access to the slides, and then any additional resources, we can have a conversation on that, and or any support. Happy to help you out as well. Okay, so just to kind of summarize really the planning stages and what goes into those plans. The biggest thing is, I'm going to flip this around a bit, but it's just, if you take the 2 points there, people first and know your values, I think that should be at the top of basically not only crisis planning, but anything and everything that we're doing. If you don't have a good understanding of kind of your values, whether that's at a corporate level, or even if you're in a situation where it's a personal issue or attack, you need to have those at the top of mind. So, because that really guides everything that you really do. So once you kind of have those, it's just identifying those key messages. Best practice is to really try not to have more than 3. But that being said, you could identify different audiences that require different messages. So it could be different segmentation of 3. So you could have more. It's not saying stick just to 3. Your general messages may be 3, but determining the audiences or who you're speaking to, you may have 3 additional, or supporting points that support your general key messages. So it's really important to have those, not necessarily in the crisis communications plan, but when you're implementing the crisis planning or steps, is to have those messages and modify accordingly. Big thing is honesty. So, which can be very tricky sometimes depending on the situation and what can and can't be shared. Sometimes there may be legal issues. Sometimes it's privacy issues. It's just, sometimes you just can't share things, where sometimes you might think, oh, if I could just get this or say this, it would cure it all. Well, sometimes it's not that easy. So it's really about thinking, again, going all the way back to the planning and the messaging, what can we say, but also being as honest as possible in the moment and the situation. The speed to deliver the messages and the availability around that. So going back to what I mentioned about speed and timeliness, whatever that looks like in the current situation or for your organization, be mindful that, again, I can't stress this enough. If sometimes being fast and first out can escalate the situation. So it's really about understanding what the timeline and speed looks like, and you can build that into your plan. If you've come to an agreement that, yeah, no, we want to be prepared to respond to social media or anything within half an hour of the tweet. If you can do that, if you have all the messages, if all your ducks are in a row and the things are in place, and that's the standard you adhere to, great. But if it's not, and then build it out, right? So don't be just, sometimes I find people run into the trap if they read stuff, they say, we got to do it within 15 minutes. Well, if you're not ready, then it could be a detriment. So just whatever that looks like, whatever speed looks like for you, use that. But also, you can't just ignore things either. Don't just push it off or say, we'll get to it. There has to be some sort of timeliness involved. sometimes within your organizations, you might have multiple spokespeople, or it might be identified that, you know, our CEO speaks on all crisis issues. Just make sure whoever that is identified within the plan. And then also when you're enacting the plan, you're just preparing them accordingly. So that could look like media training. That's something that we do a presentation on that as well. So just make sure you're giving your spokespeople as much information that you feel they need to handle and deal with the situation. This next point here is a little, it sounds a bit funny, but it's almost be prepared to be betrayed. Maybe I'll preface that with saying be prepared or expect the unexpected would be, I guess, one of the terms we can use. So always be mindful that there are people or there are audiences, or there's someone who has an experience with you or your organization from past, current, whatever that may be. Someone has an opinion. And then on the flip side, this could be used in a positive way as well. But in terms of this, in a crisis situation, there could be negative things, and you see it all the time. Well, oh, this person came out now, or this is the latest that came out on that. So be prepared to kind of almost do a deep organizational kind of check moment and get those skeletons out of the closet, for the lack of a better term. Again, it's just understanding what is out there, what might happen, and then be prepared for it. So an example might happen. It's like, oh yeah, we know of this person or this group. We kind of been aware of it. We've been keeping an eye. This is how we're gonna treat that. So it's just, if you have that, it's a lot better than saying, oh, I had no idea this person even existed. Why? Then you start getting the questions. Why didn't we know about that? Or sometimes people have experience with a higher level. They may say, how come you didn't tell me about this person? So then it's just like you're stuck in a sticky situation there. So as much as you can, and I know you're not going to know everything, but as much as you can really research and understand, it'll definitely go a long way. Document your decisions and the steps that you're taking, and you can use them in future iterations of the plans. Make notes. It's always good in every situation, whether it's a very terrible crisis, or even if it's a positive news story, it's always good to reflect, regroup, and kind of rehash the situation and document it and learn from it, right? So take those steps, do a maybe debrief when the time is right after in this situation, a crisis situation. Once the dust is sort of settled, maybe gather the team again and walk through like what worked. We have our plan. Did it work? Were these the right people contacted? So just always revisit that and just understand of potential areas that you may could have done better on, or if you look at it, you're like, that's all we could have done. That's what we have documented. I don't think we could have done any better. And then it just, when you're trying to maybe, if someone, I guess an example would be if this really affected someone deeply, or depending on the situation, it's reassuring maybe to them in the moment where you're like, yeah, we did all we could do, and we just have to, like I said before, ride it out. Sometimes time is all that it can really do or take. So it's one example there. And then final point is be prepared for those difficult, tricky, like sometimes even creepy crawly, skin crawling questions, because if you're not prepared for them, those are the situations where you might get them and you will not know how to answer, or then someone could take that answer and spin it or whatever. But so I know it can be hard, and when we're dealing with these crisis situations, it's usually in the negative, but be prepared for those difficult questions. The more prepared you can be, the easier it'll be to navigate. So that wraps up sort of the best practice summary. And I did just want to say, when we're dealing with crisis communications or even crisis situations in general, and I sort of touched on it, it's always important to really sometimes take a step back and be a little easy on yourself too. I don't know the level of what everyone has in terms of how much they deal with crisis, or for some it's their day-to-day job. I know some people we've worked with like police services or some areas where it's everyday situations are crisis driven, and it's usually not the best stuff. But in even that being said, like something that might be not necessarily the doom and gloom scenario, it could be very stressful, and it could be maybe a data breach or your email was hacked, and it's like, oh, this is the worst thing that could have happened. Like, just step back and we talk about empathy, but be kind to yourself when you're dealing with that as well, because as soon as you start to sort of lose that, then it's harder to really navigate these difficult issues. So just a little mental health self-care tip as we start to wrap up. But does anyone have any questions, or if there's anything they want me to expand upon? Now's your time to really get into that. Okay, so we're going to give you a little bit of gift of time here. So it's 10:47. So I just have my slide up here with my contact information. Feel free to email me, give me a call, text after this presentation if there's a question that you have, or if you want to maybe talk about how I could help with your crisis communications planning needs. We can definitely have a conversation. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity to share. I hope it was helpful. And if that's it, we'll wrap up. But once again, thanks again for taking the time out of your busy day to join me today, and have a great day, everyone. Thanks.